Okay, so now we get to talk about evolution. Evolution is by far my favorite topic. You may wonder, like, why is it my favorite topic, right? So essentially, it's a natural explanation of why all of the things we've been talking about this entire course is the way it is, why it is right now, how we went from essentially molecules, simple molecules, billions of years ago, to the complexity of life that we see today, and the processes that we've been talking about as well. So this is an underlying theme of everything we've learned so far, and the AP Biology exam loves to add evolution to almost every single topic. And I'm going to kind of talk you guys through how it applies to almost everything. But it really is the why and the how of everything that we've been going through. So, and also it's really cool because this is a naturalistic explanation, scientific explanation to how we got here and why we are the way we are. So in that sense, it's really interesting as well. So the first thing, you have to understand the definition of it, like what is evolution? So evolution is essentially change over time, and specifically a change in species over time. So what is a species? A species is a group of individuals that can all possibly interbreed to produce viable offspring. We'll talk about that a little bit later, a little bit more, but this process yields all the biodiversity that we see on Earth and that we have seen in the past, or not seen because we weren't around. This is specifically, as I said, a change in a species over time, in populations. Individuals cannot evolve. That is an important thing that you have to remember. Individuals, like you, as yourself, cannot evolve in the biological sense. Populations evolve. It's due to changes in frequencies of different traits occurring due to differential survival and reproduction, and we'll talk about that as we continue to go along. This first video is pretty much just about what evolution is and the history behind how we eventually got to this theory. Now remember, what is a theory again? A theory is something that has been tested over and over and over again. It explains a wide variety of phenomena and has never shown to be incorrect. So remember, the definition of theory in a scientific sense is much more powerful than it is used in everyday language. All right, so let's start kind of in the history of evolutionary thought. Let's start in the beginning, right? So the Old Testament, right? Species were all designed by God. All species that exist now have always existed in the Garden of Eden, in Genesis. Okay, and they kind of, the Bible goes through all of that whole process. But it's this idea that everything was kind of fixed. Like people thought everything was fixed and always has been. It hasn't really changed. So that was the original thought process. Now, and that makes complete sense. If individual people are writing it over the course of even 1,000 years, there is very little change in species. We're seeing a lot of change in species now because of how humans have really spread throughout the world and have significantly altered the environment that they're in, causing more species to have to evolve a little bit more quickly, but also massive amounts of extinction events. Again, and we'll talk about that more when we get into ecology, which is the last topic we're going to cover. All right, so then there's Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. Life forms can be scaled, can be arranged on a scale of increasing complexity. So, and he said that humans were the culmination of all of that complexity. Now, at least he's getting somewhere, right? Like when you think of complexity, more simple things like prokaryotes. Now, he didn't know what those were because they didn't have microscopes back then. But simple things, they would be able to see things like insects and stuff. So that would be much more simple, or like starfish or something like that, to us being the most complex. And humans would rule kind of over everything else, right? That was the prevailing thought back then. So now we're going to fast forward a little bit further. Now, I just want to preface this. All these people are not required to know. There are a few people, and I'll tell you, but so far you don't really have to know anyone. Linnaeus, you do want to know, at least in terms of how he came up with his naming system. So he's considered the father of taxonomy, and he grouped and named organisms based on similarities. So he kind of like sorted them into groups, and he did this through increasingly generalized categories. We talked about this. There's one of the first things we talked about at the beginning of the year, what the King Philip crossed over from German soil. That's the way I remember it: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But he thought he did this based on the pattern of creation, again based on that complexity idea, that I just talked about. So he created this idea, or this naming system, called binomial nomenclature, and it's a two-part name that it consists of two things: the genus and the specific name. Collectively, those two names together become the species. So, for example, we are Homo sapiens. The Homo is the genus. Now none of them are currently in existence, but there were other Homo species previously that existed, all of which are extinct. Sapiens is the specific name, but sapiens doesn't mean anything by itself. The species is both names put together. Homo sapiens, that's our species. Does that make sense? E. coli, or Escherichia coli. Escherichia is the genus, coli is the specific name, the species is Escherichia coli. Okay, some other guys that are important to understand, especially when it comes to the scope of understanding how Darwin came up with his theory and his thought process. So Jules Cuvier came up with catastrophism. And this is based on the Bible, the principle that events in the past must have occurred suddenly and by different mechanisms than those today. And we say that's not true, right? So everything that we understand about how the universe works, how the laws of physics works, is that they are unchanging. Those laws have not changed. But Georges Cuvier wanted to fit in the scope of the Bible, the idea that the Earth is only about 10,000 years old, to what he sees using mechanisms of science, right? So back in the day, it must have occurred way differently, and things must have happened really quickly, especially early on when God was creating things, versus what's happening today, this kind of slower mechanism of change. Okay, so that was Cuvier. Lyell. Now we're moving in the right direction. Lyell said, and he had this idea of uniformitarianism, the idea that this is the opposite, essentially, of Cuvier. The idea that the same geological processes are going on now have been always going on since the beginning of the Earth. That means the laws of physics have not changed. Now, obviously, things back then were different, right? The Earth could have changed quicker because of, varying geological processes, the fact that there was maybe more molten material underneath the Earth. So things were different, but they still followed the same laws. So Lyell is much more correct, and he said, because of that means that the Earth must be way older than 10,000 years. And he said, it must be an insane amount of time, like 1 million years, right? To them, 1 million years was inconceivable in terms of the amount of time that would be. We've now since dwarfed that, right? The age of the Earth that we've calculated to be 4.6 billion years. So, but at the time, he's at least moving in the right direction of the idea of the correct way in which to think about how life on Earth could have came about. Okay, so Lamarck you do have to know. And you've learned about Lamarckian evolution previously with Miss Bebeck if you had her. So he stated that he came up with the first real solid theory of evolution that was well studied. And it was called the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics, or use and disuse theory. So if something was used more significantly over the course of time, based on changes in the environment, an organism would have to use something a little bit more often. Over the course of generations, that part would become larger and stronger, or could change function. And if it wasn't used, it would deteriorate over generations. Now, he didn't really have a mechanism by which this actually worked, but in theory, that seems to make sense, especially in terms of, the way we see things. It's like, giraffes have longer necks than most other mammals because they reach the leaves that are higher in the trees. And how did that happen? Over the course of a long time, because they kept stretching their necks further and further. And we'll get to a picture that shows this in a second. That over the course of time, their necks just grew, right? Because they needed them to survive. Or we could actually kind of test his theory, technically, right? So weightlifters, people like men and women who lift lots of weight and have more muscular anatomy, what would we expect to happen? So we have a father that is not, this guy actually looks like this, but those are not real muscles. They're like, there's an injection thing, so don't be too concerned. Okay, so this father, right? What would you expect the son to look like, compared to maybe him when he was a kid? Because of his constant weightlifting, you'd expect his son to be ridiculously jacked. But that is not how this works. He would not have a son that's any different. We know that, and specifically muscle mass and things like that, there is inherited characteristics where people have more or less of it just naturally, but you can really change that through, working out and increasing muscle mass that way. But that is not evolution, this process, right? His son would not be muscular. Here's Lamarck's giraffe. This is his classic example, the one I mentioned. So like an ancestor giraffe millions of years ago, or thousands of years ago, according to, depending, they didn't really know the times back then, right? But that as long as he kept reaching, his neck would stretch longer and longer to reach higher branches over the course of generations, but it's driven by what's called inner need, right? You need this to happen over the course of time, and it would change. Again, he had no real mechanism for this. So his theory of use and disuse was actually, I don't want to say it was disproven, but there's evidence to support that this was not correct. So August Weismann, because he was like, well, mice don't really even need their tails, really, so let's see if, based on use and disuse, let's get rid of their tails. So he actually chopped mouse tails off. It seems like such a weird way to kind of disprove this, but this was actually very significant. He cut the tails off these mice, and then over time, he expected the tails would get smaller and smaller with each generation. This did not end up happening, though. Essentially, what happened is they had children, and their children still had tails. So Lamarck's idea that, okay, let's just cut off their tails, it would get a little bit shorter over time because they're not using them anymore, that was shown to be incorrect. Okay, Malthus. Now Malthus, again, not someone I don't think the AP will ever ask about him by name, but his essay on the principle of population, if you took AP Euro or AP World, I'm pretty sure you've learned about Malthus, but he wrote in his essay on the principle of population this idea that, and I love this quote, the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. So what that means is, if a population increases in size, eventually we're going to run out of space, resources. It's going to cause disease to increase. So what the earth will do is kind of keep the population of humans, and he just applied this to humans, in check. So essentially he said we have limited resources in space, and as the population grows, its size will be checked by famine, war, disease, the ability for the earth to allow for sustenance, right? So Malthus was really important in Darwin's ideas. So let me get to Charles Darwin now. Darwin, I have a whole story about his life that I won't get into right now. If you want, I can show you. There's a lot of interesting documentaries you can watch on Darwin's life. But essentially what Darwin did was he was really interested in Lamarck's ideas, and really interested in understanding why life existed and how it became to be. So he originally wanted to be, or his father wanted him to be clergy, or to work for the church, and he wasn't really that interested in that. So he decided to do a voyage on the HMS Beagle, which is the name of the ship, to the Galapagos Islands, and around the world in general he kind of did. But the Galapagos really was the area where Darwin really kind of solidified his theory. Imagine, because Darwin went to the Galapagos, he had a very unique experience compared to almost anyone else on the earth. Not many people, at that time had been to the Galapagos Islands. And there are a lot of characteristics of the Galapagos that make it interesting. We'll talk about them, as we go through this. But he noticed also, he paid attention to things that other people were not paying attention to. He was well read. He read Malthus. He read Lyell. He read Lamarck. And he would climb to the top of the mountain, and the top of the mountain he'd see fossils of shells and fish up at the top of these mountains. He'd be like, what's going on with that? It seems so bizarre. Maybe this area used to be completely submerged underwater. And in order for that to happen based on these normal processes, like Lyell said, the Earth must be super old. He also was looking at these individual species that were so in tune with exactly what they did, right? Their niche, or niche as some people say. I don't like saying that. I think it sounds pretentious. But their niche of what they want, or where they live, their role. And they have these characteristics that make them perfectly suited to be able to do that. Like, how is that possible? And he looked at finches and things like that. And finally, he came up with his theory. Now let's talk about his theory real quick. So he came up with this idea that individuals in a population are different. All of these things are things that are completely logical. He just made these connections. Individuals in a population are different. They vary in characteristics, something everyone can see. Now, in human beings, it's very obvious, but that also is true for things like, fish or squirrels, even though we don't pay that much attention to them. There are differences, okay? Nothing anyone can really argue. He also pondered that the variation is heritable. That can be passed down to your offspring, right? So these traits that are similar in two parents through sexual reproduction can be passed to their children. That variation is heritable. That's what that means, or inherited. Progeny is another term for kids. Sometimes I like to call my children my progeny. If you probably have heard me say that sometimes. Okay, the next part he came. Both things very logical. No one is arguing this. The next thing he said, that there is a struggle for existence. Individuals are going to struggle due to limited resources and mates. He got that idea from Malthus and reading and understanding Malthus, right? That there's not enough food and space and materials, and because of disease, there's not enough of these things to allow for life to all exist and keep increasing in population size. He also knew, and everyone knew at this time, that you could do artificial selection. So artificial selection is essentially breeding. What we do is humans will select desirable traits and force mate those animals or plants together to get those characteristics that we want. So that's how we get the different varieties of apples that we've had, these different types of cows that are better at doing different things. All of the breeds of dogs that we have came from an ancestral wolf species. Let me give you an example for a cow. Like if you take a cow that was really drought resistant, and you also take a cow that is, produces a lot of meat, but is not drought resistant, and the drought resistant one didn't produce a lot of meat. Well, those two cows, we'd mate them together, and you get some cows that sadly were both didn't produce a lot of meat and were not drought resistant. But you'd also get cows that had both of those traits. You get cows that had drought resistance and had a lot of meat, and then they take those and mate those ones together, eventually creating these different breeds of cow, right? Same thing with dogs. The traits that you most wanted, they bred together and created all of these different, I won't call them subspecies, but breeds of dog. And that happened over the course of, most of our breeds of dogs came about in the last 100 years. So there were other ones within the last, 500 years or so. But most of them came about in the last few hundred years. And that's an amazing amount of change in such a short amount of time when you think about the vast expanse of time that we have. So Darwin thought, what if nature did the selecting instead of humans? The individuals that were best fit to survive and reproduce in the environment due to these limiting resources, these limiting factors. Those that were not as fit in quotations, right? I'll talk about fitness in a second, had less opportunities to mate, they wouldn't survive as often, and thus not mate as often. The ones that were better would mate more often, and as a result, they would pass their superior traits for surviving in that environment to their offspring. Does that make sense? So you have to understand this, though. Fitness in this term does not mean anything other than the ability to reproduce. Someone can be super superior and survive fantastically, but if they don't reproduce, their fitness is zero, nothing, because it doesn't matter if you're not mating at all, right? You have to mate in order to have fitness. So Darwin's theory of natural selection, simply stated as follows, and you should memorize this. I would recommend it to be able, or at least talk about this logically. You have to say every single logical step in to make his final point. Individuals vary, they're different. That variation is heritable. That means it can be passed on from parents to offspring. There is a struggle for existence in a population. He got that from Malthus because of limiting resources space. Those with the best adaptations or characteristics that will enhance an organism's ability to survive and reproduce will mate more often and pass those superior characteristics in that environment to their offspring. This will result in a change in the frequency of traits or alleles over time in that population, which by definition is evolution. And you should know this by heart. All right, that's it for this video.